folks on the phone, hello and welcome. Good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are in the world. I am Pope Ward, and my partner Karen here and I run the research organization for the Advisory Board for the Arts. Our topic today is communicating with audiences through closure, lessons from the Atlantic magazine. We're very grateful to everyone who could join us today. It's a challenging time, and I know that cutting out time to spend with us does not come at no cost. Quite a group are the members of the Advisory Board for the Arts you see over here on the left-hand side, many of whom are with us today, and we've also got many other guests. You can see those on the right-hand side here. It's an impressive and diverse group. We're very excited to be with you all today. Also very excited to have our co-hosts with us today, Julie Dixon and Trinity Redding of Atlantic 57, which is the creative and consulting arm of the Atlantic magazine. They help all kinds of companies from nonprofits to Fortune 500s to media organizations apply the Atlantic way of thinking to their own brand marketing and communication efforts. We are so impressed with the spirit of generosity that's been displayed by experts across the spectrum over this crisis period, and you two are shining examples. So thanks so much for making the time to spend with us today. Our plan is to run this conversation in three parts. We'll start with just a bit of housekeeping and introductions. Then we'll hand it over to Trinity and to Julie, who will share a set of lessons from the Atlantic's own work connecting with audiences through this closure period. And finally, we'll pull up to ask them a set of questions, which will include, of course, your own questions should you have any. But first, let me move on to that housekeeping. If you have questions at any time during the session today, I hope that you will type them into your chat box. You'll find that either at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, depending on which gremlin installed Zoom for you. And Karen will keep questions logged over the course of discussion. We may stop a time or two while Julie and Trinity are sharing their story, but we will certainly have time at the end to do that. If you want, you can private chat Karen during the session by switching the two from everyone to Karen Freeman. I know that everyone is probably pretty comfortable with Zoom at this point, but just to get our fingers limbered up, if you could go to the chat box and type in who you are and where you're from, we'll know that that's working, and it'll give us all more confidence in that technology. All right, as we suspected, familiarity with Zoom, fantastic. We have muted your audio and video, as I mentioned before. We're doing this to keep the discussion running smoothly, to avoid talk over, and just to make sure that we can hear Trinity and Julie clearly throughout the session. So it would be great if you could adhere to that. Speaking of Trinity and Julie, I'd love to take a moment to introduce you to both of them. For those of you all who don't know the Atlantic, it is one of America's premier media organizations. It was begun in 1857 when it was founded as an abolitionist monthly, and ever since then it has prided itself on challenging our assumptions and pursuing the truth. That's its mission. And across the past decade, The Atlantic has multiplied its readership and transformed itself financially by learning to connect with audiences deeply on social media. So there's got to be an analog in there somewhere for our own organizations right now, I suspect. Atlantic 57, which is the Atlantic's consulting arm, was formed in order to help other organizations achieve similar success using lessons from the Atlantic itself. And so our guest hosts today will share some of those lessons. Trinity, Julie, I'd love for you all to take a minute just to introduce yourselves. Should we start with you, Trinity?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Trinity Redding. I am the Group Engagement Director at Atlantic 57, which essentially means that I run our partnerships and delivery projects and engagements with clients like McKinsey, Salesforce, and others. And very pleased to be here with you all today to share some of our learning around both how to communicate during this time with your audiences, and we'll be sprinkling throughout some sort of broader audience engagement lessons as well.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Dixon, and I'm a director of strategy on the Atlantic 57 team. I lead a lot of our engagements with nonprofits and foundations and media organizations around strategic planning and digital strategy. Really excited to be here this morning. I'm also, when I'm not doing my day job, I'm a professional musician and actor. And I've spent a lot of much of the past 7 or 8 weeks with my colleagues and friends who are actors and administrators in arts organizations. So really happy to be a part of today's conversation and to get to share what we've learned at the Atlantic with all of you.
Thank you both. Really appreciate you being here. So Trinity and Julie will take us on a trip through changes that have taken place in Atlantic during the time of COVID in order to be of service to the Atlantic community now. So they'll spend the rest of our session talking about those lessons. As I mentioned, we may stop once or twice in the middle to ask a question or two, but for the most part, we'll hold questions for the end, and be assured we'll have time for that. So with that, Trinity, Julie, take it away.
Great. So I'm going to start today. There we go. Before we get into sort of the specific lessons that the Atlantic has taken away so far during the pandemic, wanted to sort of set the scene for you all a bit by sharing the realities facing publishers, brands across all industries, even prior to COVID. So I don't know if this comes as a surprise or a shock to anyone on the line, but US adults spend an average of 12 hours per day connected to media. That's a lot. That's pretty much all day long. And if you look at the sort of trend over time, you can see that it was a consistent state of growth across the last several years. However, we're seeing now that this is plateauing, and we think it's plateauing for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think just the general reality of the situation is there may not be more time to spend consuming media. But there's also just the reality of the situation that people don't necessarily want more content. They've sort of hit their limit there. They don't really need more information anymore. They need better information. Right? At the Atlantic, we thought a lot about this, and prior to COVID-19, our story output was down about 7.5% over the last year, even though we've added journalists and even though our audience has grown significantly. We're seeing better engagement results, actually. So despite producing less, we are getting better results. And there's a couple of factors that we see kind of informing that change. So audience behaviors are shifting. 41% of US adults often or sometimes avoid the news, which probably that number looks a little bit different today, I think, depending on the day. We see 74% of respondents report that they're actively avoiding advertising or any type of marketing or sales to them. And 55% of customers say that trusting a brand now matters more than ever. So what does this mean, right? It means that competition is high and expectations are high. Audiences are much more conscious of what they consume, and they're placing a higher premium on trust. So here are some of the things that they're looking for. Formats that fit into their lives. So they're thinking about what are those kind of micro moments throughout the day? What are the opportunities that they have to flip through Twitter, to look at newsletters they may be signed up for. The way that we approach kind of thinking about content at The Atlantic is to take it from the audience's point of view and their preferences, and making sure that every interaction with us is valuable, even if it's just a tweet or a headline that they're reading online. They're also looking for, there we go, stories that stick with them. So, they want to read interesting information, they want it to be valuable, and they want to leave that experience with your content feeling like they learned something valuable or they had a really good, meaningful interaction with that. And finally, they are looking for brands that they can trust. And I think thinking from an arts organization perspective, there are a lot of implications here. I think there's a lot of good news, actually. On the previous slide, we talked about avoiding the news and avoiding advertising. That can lead to, directing that attention towards content like yours that offers a bit of an escape. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can build in those moments of escape with our audience, even during a time of crisis. And second, I think this kind of point around brands that they can trust, it's just as important for an arts organization as it is for a publisher, as it is for someone that they are shopping with on a regular basis. Consumers don't automatically have a reason to distrust arts organizations the way that they may kind of have that natural inclination to mistrust other types of brands. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just rest on your laurels and wait for them to come to you, especially now when it's sort of impossible for you all to build trust and to build those relationships through the primary touch points that you all have relied on for so long, which is, of course, in-person interactions with your art. And we'll talk a little bit in a bit about how trying to retrofit your in-person experiences for digital channels can actually undercut some of the trust with your audiences. But I think at the end of the day, this is a big opportunity for brands, for organizations that are genuine, that are authentic, and can generally be trusted. And so when we think about where we're going today, right? Our heads are spinning a little bit. And this quote from Liz Neely, I think, sums it up really well. It has never been so important to get people to pay attention to hard truths, and perhaps it has never been as difficult to do that as it is now. The key is to confront the most brutal facts of reality unflinchingly while maintaining an unwavering hope for the future. So in short, we're all looking for truths, we're all looking for facts, we're looking for guidance to comprehend what's happening around us and make informed decisions. And we're also looking for ways to manage all of this emotionally and to feel like, although we're all apart, we're experiencing this together, that we'll all get through this together. And again, for you all, a big opportunity. Who else is better positioned to demonstrate compassion, empathy, than your organizations right now? And I think the second part of that is also you have a really interesting opportunity to tell stories that humanize and connect us all to the parts of ourselves that allow us to escape to things that are really meaningful to our lives. And so it is this mix of education and compassion that's driving The Atlantic's response to COVID-19. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Julie Dixon, to talk us through it.
Great, thanks, Trinity. So we have 3 lessons that we're going to share over the course of the rest of our conversation. And before that, just wanted to give you a little context on what we've been doing at The Atlantic. I imagine many of you might be readers. You may have seen some of the things that we've been doing on the website, but to give you a little behind the scenes look of how we've been thinking about that. So our newsroom has responded to this moment around COVID-19 by producing really vital journalism, by shaping both the public conversation as well as personal decision-making around the virus. And we've seen our audience more than double in March and April. We just got some stats in yesterday that are hot off the presses. So in March, we saw a record readership on the website to 87 million unique visitors, which is a lot. And we're also seeing, I mean, these are all the metrics that as a publisher you love to see. People are sticking around longer. We have twice as many readers who are finishing articles. And I think more importantly than any of the stats that you see, we're actually influencing the conversation. And an example of that is Ed Young's article, How the Pandemic Will End, which as of the time that we put these slides together was the 2nd most read article in all of the Atlantic's history. And that's only having been published for the last 5 or 6 weeks or so. It's garnered praise from President Obama. Other highlights, Glossier, which is one of the first retailers in the country to close its brick and mortar stores last month. They did so because the CEO had read the March 10th article, Cancel Everything. We also launched a new daily podcast called Social Distance, which I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. We launched that basically overnight. And in just a couple of weeks, we've had about 200,000 people who have downloaded it. So the 4 stories that you see highlighted on this slide are a snapshot of our most read coverage since the virus took hold in the US as of when we put these slides together. And I think what this really does is it showcases the breadth of how The Atlantic is serving our audiences in this moment. You've got, on the one hand, a scientific roadmap for how to address the virus. The second article there you see is a bold assessment of our country's leadership during this time. The third article is an example of a warning about the personal impact and responsibilities that we all have. And then on the far right, we see an emotional firsthand account of what it's like to be on the front lines. So we're taking a lot of different angles in our approach. Go to the next slide. So how is this happening? So we're not the biggest news organization. We are not the size of the New York Times. We're not the size of the Washington Post. At the same time, we're not being opportunistic, and we aren't really drastically pivoting our strategy. We're really playing to the strengths that we already had before this. And the reason that we're succeeding is because we are helping people in a moment of crisis in a way that's true to our brand. Now, we're a publisher, so we have our own unique way of responding to the crisis. And so what we're going to share now is lessons from our newsroom, from The Atlantic, that we believe are really relevant for brands across all industries who are looking to serve their audiences right now and to serve their brands in this unique moment. And so those 3 lessons are, number 1, position your brand for service over commerce. Number 2, match your mindset to your audience's mindset. And number 3, be nimble now for endurance later. And I'll walk through each one of these and give you some examples. So our first lesson, position your brand for service over commerce. So we've all, I'm sure, received dozens, if not by now hundreds of emails from brands about how they are quote unquote here for you, or, we're all in this together in this moment. We've seen Budweiser can get us through these difficult times. I'm sure many, if not all of the organizations on the call today, you sent some variant of these messages to your mailing list, to your donors, to your patrons. Some of the brands in the marketplace are backing up this feel-good messaging with real service. For example, one of the organizations we do a lot of work with, Allstate, has refunded customer premium payments, for example. You see Uber Eats is waiving customer delivery fees when you're ordering from local restaurants. Certainly examples of this abound among arts organizations, thinking about all of the educational programming that some of you have brought to life and, really quickly scaled to meet the needs of parents and children. So there's a lot of really great examples of brands that are adapting this kind of service mindset. And then there are others who just sort of send out this messaging and it's hollow and it's a half-hearted attempt to kind of pander to emotions and to drum up business. And this is a really short-sighted approach. Audiences can see right through it, and it creates this negative connotation for your brand. And what we're seeing is that audiences right now trust brands that are putting service over commerce. And these are the brands that will really endure post-COVID-19. And as we're seeing at The Atlantic, service and putting service first has actually bolstered our commerce. So as COVID-19 began to take hold, we made a decision within The Atlantic to take most of our coverage of the virus and make it free to all of our readers. And for a little context around like why that decision was noteworthy, it's because we had just last year launched a metered paywall for our website. So no longer could you access all of The Atlantic's content for free on the website, you had to pay for it. So when the virus took hold last month, we made the decision to make all of it free. We were publishing really vital information about public and personal health, and we felt like it would be really callous to deprive our readers of it. So the tension there is, you think that we would be sacrificing valuable subscription revenue and in some ways hindering our business by doing this. But in fact, what we saw is that the opposite has happened. In March, while we were offering this coverage for free, and into April now, we've continued this, we've seen 37,000 new subscriptions in March alone. That number was nearly equaled in April. And that's 3 times our average new subscriptions in a given month. So essentially what happened is we served our audience first and we saw an increase in commerce. So how is that possible? Part of it is our readers showing appreciation for what we were doing, but I think it's actually more than that. It's that in every interaction that we have with our readers, we're serving them by offering the best of what we have to offer. Go to the next slide. I can show you an example of what this looks like. So it's almost a set of ingredients for every piece of content that we publish. What is it that we can offer that is unique to us and that will serve our audiences and their needs? And so specifically with respect to COVID-19, our team went in and we wanted to analyze, what is that secret sauce? What is that framework that The Atlantic uses to ensure that it's offering something that essentially no one else can offer? And what we found in our coverage of COVID-19 is there's a couple of common ingredients. The first is that all of the pieces have an original idea. So we know that our audiences can get the latest news from a lot of places. New York Times, Washington Post are more focused on the what's happening question. When they come to The Atlantic, we really want to give them an aha moment, this kind of unexpected realization or understanding that they can't find anywhere else. The example on this page, "The Kids Aren't All Right," was a piece that counters the idea that children aren't at risk by examining the long-term impact of the trauma of living through this crisis. So grappling with these really big ideas, these unexpected ideas. The second piece in our formula, so to speak, is having credible expertise. So we're not in the business of offering an off-the-cuff opinion. The perspectives that we offer in all of our pieces are really backed by a range of science and health experts. And the example of this is Ed Young's article, "How the Pandemic Will End," features and cites 22 different experts. And of course, reporting this takes time. We actually gave Ed 2 weeks just to focus on this story alone, really resisting the urge to publish something of lesser value more quickly. And the payoff is that this article alone accounted for nearly 1,500 new subscriptions and more than 20,000 new signups to our daily newsletter. So the stats are pretty staggering, and I would imagine they have gone up since we put these slides together. And finally, on the far right, the third piece in our formula is emotional alignment. So we're not naive enough to think that people are navigating this crisis just through facts. We really have to acknowledge right now that the rational and sometimes irrational fears and curiosities and hopes of our readers. An example of this is Lori Gottlieb, who is a licensed therapist who writes a regular column for the magazine. And her guide to staying sane during the pandemic, which you see here, offers a really fact-based expert perspective on how to manage this mix of emotions that we're all feeling. So the goal with every piece is to provide clarity instead of perpetuating confusion. So this framework for service that we've landed on really could work for any brand, although the exact ingredients may or should vary depending on your particular strengths. So again, it's all about, you know, finding those things that you do well, that differentiate you from your peers. Another example that's outside of the arts realm is an organization that we've worked with, PwC, and they've taken somewhat of a similar approach. So as companies across the country began to really grapple with the impact of COVID-19 on their business and on their employees, this difficult decision seemed to emerge. The question is, do we choose the health of the economy over the health of our citizens? And this example is a widely shared piece that was published to LinkedIn. It's kind of a piece of thought leadership from PwC's US chair. And he offered a perspective that seemed somewhat novel at the time. It's since become the basis for a lot of companies, which is, what if we don't have to choose? So his writing on LinkedIn follows a lot of the ingredients that we saw in the Atlantic's coverage. So he has an original idea. We will emerge in better shape if we follow the guiding principles that we will do what we can to put people first by protecting their jobs and livelihoods. Second, he showcases credible expertise via this concrete business decision that he's made for his company. And you see the quote in the middle of the slide there. You know, at PwC, we have adopted the principle that we will only consider laying off employees as a last result. And finally, and I say this is probably somewhat rare for a CEO of a really large company, he makes an emotional connection with the employees who feel like they are themselves grappling with an impossible situation. He says, our feeling is that if this is going to be a hard year for people, it shouldn't be a good year for profits. So this piece received tons of engagement on social media, had 5,000 engagements, 300 comments. So it's a really great example of, you know, finding that formula that works and really playing on your strengths and leading again with service over commerce. We're seeing a lot of examples of this among arts organizations as well, organizations that are leading with service instead of potentially, you know, fundraising asks and things like that. So when I kick it over to Pope just briefly to talk through some of the examples that your team is seeing. Yep, I think you're on mute.
Hi, how are you? Sorry. I was sparing you my family life. We're seeing a lot of new kind of jobs that people are trying to get done in their lives in the midst of this crisis. And one of those is, as you can see over on the left, simply expressing their support for those whom they're grateful to. And I think everyone on this call will agree that we're all looking for an outlet to be able to do that. The La Jolla Playhouse reached out to audiences with their staff and simply asked them how they were doing, one at a time, not in a text message, not in an email, but by calling them up and asking them how they were doing. A great example of service over commerce. The Berlin Philharmonic, similar to you all, has had content for charge over time, and they have changed the game there and made it all free. I'm sure that on a future call or webinar, we'll talk more about high production value in our outreach to audiences in this time. But if you are looking for a fantastic example that you just got to go to their site and experience it, it's at the very high range of what we've seen. And they're over on the right, the Atlanta Opera has equally reached out to audiences. They've solicited requests from people in their community to nominate those who could use kind of an uplift in a moment. And they've gone out into the community with singing telegrams from their own artists in order to share those with people in the community, obviously from a distance and through glass, but nonetheless, a desire to reach out and not close in.
Great. So as we can see in all of these, as well as the previous examples, we come back to this idea that, delivering on our brand can only be possible if we really truly understand what it is that our audiences need right now, and that may not be exactly what they needed from us before. And that's a great segue into our next lesson, which is to match your mindset to your audience's mindset. So as Trinity mentioned before, this is a rare global event that has impacted and will impact everyone in a variety of different ways. Emotions are varied, understandably, from frightened to angry to overwhelmed to lonely to hopeful. And I'm sure you're all seeing and hearing that from your teams, from your patrons, from your donors. People are experiencing these emotions through identities as individuals, as family members, as artists, as employees, as members of broader society, and we're all processing information in different ways at different speeds, and we're reacting in different ways. So it's really important for any organization to understand this variety of mindsets their audiences may be in right now, and to understand how quickly those mindsets are shifting as new information becomes available to them, and as their own lives are shaped by this crisis. So one way to do this is to anticipate what your audiences may need. So what we see on this slide is a graph of Google search terms, Google search trends for the term social distancing, which it's hard to imagine that a mere 7 weeks ago that term barely existed, and now it's just part of our daily vocabulary. But you'll see that it spiked back around about March 16th as it became the preferred practice of experts who are hoping to slow the curve of the virus. You'll also see that on March 12th, The Atlantic published an article called The Do's and Don'ts of Social Distancing. This piece explains the concept, and it then runs through questions like, can I go to the gym? Or can I take public transportation? And each of the questions featured answers from multiple health experts. And this piece was our 5th most read in March. And sparked in part by the success of that piece, we launched the podcast that I mentioned earlier called Social Distance the following day. So in both cases, we provided answers to questions that audiences really didn't know that they yet had. So the question is, how do we do this? And I would say it is equal parts judgment and data. Because our reporters in our newsroom are so plugged into the topical focus areas and the general pulse of the conversation every day, our editors really saw social distancing as a potentially widespread way to address this crisis, as well as this term that would become shorthand for how individuals can contribute, and that they're just being good at their job and identifying that. However, that gut instinct was also aided by data. So our newsroom uses a number of different tools and dashboards that show audience engagement data in real time. So it's easy for us to see which pieces are resonating as we produce them, which are resonating on the site, across social media, and on search. And so again, it's that hand-in-hand approach. It's the data that aids, and it doesn't replace the judgment. So what we've done, if you go to the next slide, we don't want to assume that we know everything about our audiences. So we've also been reaching out to take their pulse and to do some research to understand how these mindsets are shifting. So as COVID-19 began to spread last month, we actually launched a pop-up survey to better understand our audience's needs around COVID-19. And we built out this little framework here that you see on the left-hand side. And I'll walk through each one of these. And this shows you kind of what the needs were that surfaced in the research and how we've gone about addressing them through our coverage. So first, the top number one is information about how the virus is spreading and its potential impacts. So this answers a fundamental question that we've all asked ourselves about this virus. What is going on? An example of how we've addressed that is a piece that was published back in late February called "You're Likely to Get the Coronavirus," which was published by James Hamlin, who is a really popular writer. He's a physician, a non-practicing physician, and a staff writer at The Atlantic. And this piece was among the first to really highlight predictions that the virus would become widespread in the US. So that's kind of answering the first need that emerged in this research that we did about, how is the virus spreading and its potential impacts. So the second need is understanding how the US and other governments are responding. So once people were hit with the realization that COVID-19 could have widespread impact, they then wanted to know, what are their leaders doing about it? Is it under control? Are there efforts to keep people safe? And so an example of how we address that in our coverage is a piece published in the middle of March called "The Coronavirus Called America's Bluff," which chronicles how the US let its own bureaucracy get in the way of a more rapid response to the virus. The third most pressing audience need from the survey was guidance from experts on what I can do to protect myself and others. So this starts to show that the reader is taking personal responsibility. They understand the impact. They understand that government action alone will not put an end to this, and they want to know, what should I be doing about this? And so we published a piece called "What Do You Tell Someone Who Won't Stay Home?" Which is addressing a question that many of us have faced for stubborn parents or friends, or back in March for spring breakers. How do we get them to take this seriously? And obviously this is a question that has continued to divide the country significantly. So in this case, we got answers from a researcher who studies the psychology of pandemics, and a public health expert and a clinical psychologist, and brought those perspectives together. And we even put together a sample script for how to have that conversation. And finally, the number 4 audience need was for analyses on how people are self-quarantining and social distancing. So how do we do this? What is this new reality that we're facing? And this is for audiences who have decided to hunker down as best they can for the foreseeable future and are asking themselves, how do I live this new life? This piece called "How You Should Get Food During the Pandemic" was published incidentally before that Google search trend spike that was on the previous slide for social distancing. And on its surface, it's an answer to the critical, practical, and selfish question about this new lifestyle. But if you read it closely, it's also a really poignant look at the plight of service workers who are being asked to prepare and deliver food while their health, their jobs, and their families are on the line, which obviously has again become even more relevant in the recent weeks. So as you can see in this framework of understanding what our audience's needs are, by taking the effort to really understand those needs, we can address the breadth of those across our communications. And it's really clear that our audiences have a wide range of needs and pressing questions. But there is one more that you will not see on this slide here, and that is the need for distraction. If you go to the next slide. We all need to stay informed and disciplined and compassionate, certainly right now, but we also need a break from time to time. And I think, again, this is encouraging for all of us on this call. In the same audience survey, 51% of the audiences said that they visited the Atlantic for COVID news alone, but 37% said it was one of several topics, and the rest weren't looking for it at all. So COVID is certainly the dominant topic right now, but that doesn't mean that it's the only thing that anyone is looking for. We do need things to take our mind off of what's happening, or at least the dark, heavy aspects of it. So you can see a snapshot of some of the coverage that we had during the month of March. I'll highlight the very bottom one. There's this total departure that is also a really thoughtful and engrossing read if you haven't looked at it. It's a piece that takes Harry and Meghan to task. It had over 2 million page views. It was actually the highest performing non-COVID related piece on our website in March, and even outpaced some of the top performing coronavirus coverage. So, we have dozens of reporters and editors working around the clock to channel our audience, to use that editorial judgment, to back that up with data. And that's really what we're doing right now. I know it can be really hard to pull together a full research effort like that in real time the way that we have at the Atlantic, but I think at the same time there are many arts organizations that have been really thinking about how the needs of their audiences have shifted in this moment and how they can address those needs. So I'll throw it back to Pope for a minute to talk through some of the examples that your team has been seeing.
I said the really interesting thing just now that our team has been looking for different ways that arts organizations are expressing usefulness right now. And I mentioned the gratitude one before, but there is definitely an escape theme that you just mentioned. The Getty Museum just put an art museum into the popular video game Animal Crossing, so that kids can explore that. There's a recharging of the body and soul theme, that we've seen. That, by the way, I'll mention just a few examples in thumbnail, but in tomorrow's summary, we'll include links to all of this, just so you know. But if you haven't gone to dancing on their own, they have kind of ritualized attendance in these dance sessions twice a week, to get people into a cadence of kind of recharging in a communal sense, which is really fun. Probably the most common and most refreshing thing that many of us have seen are all these efforts by arts organizations to engage children specifically, while giving their parents a guilt-free break. And many of you saw the Mo Willems work that the Kennedy Center is doing a couple of weeks ago on an earlier webinar. But if you haven't gone to the site where EduHam at Home is the original cast of Hamilton is engaging children right now by exploring American history through the musical, which is kind of fun. There's an effort by many organizations to connect people, not just connect with people. And Ballet Hispanico, for example, is hosting Facebook watch parties of its own Instagram video series, which are worth checking out. But certainly that enabling audience connection is a big job that people have right now. And one final one is just allowing people to express the emotions they're feeling. It is one of the principal jobs of art, and people are encountering a lot of new ones and need an outlet for that right now. And we've seen organizations that are kind of crowdsourcing quarantine-inspired testimonials and music, and using that to produce a new musical. So we'll share all of those with you in the wrap up tomorrow.
Great. So it's one thing to understand the audience's mindset, and it's another to make your brand one of service, kind of the two lessons we've talked about already. But we also know it's just really hard to run our organizations right now. We're adapting to remote working. We are balancing work and childcare. We're missing the creativity and collaboration that comes with face-to-face interaction. So we can only serve our audiences and deliver on our brand if we adapt to new ways of working, which brings us to our final lesson, and I think my personal favorite: be nimble now for endurance later. So, we're suddenly facing big questions about our business. How do we pivot everyone to a new priority? What do we do about all the plans that we had before? When things are quote unquote back to normal, what does that even look like? And I know in talking with a number of arts organizations that all of these questions have been really top of mind. And I would add a fourth, which is, how can we use what we're learning in this frantic period right now to inform how we work and how we deliver our programming to audiences after all of this is done? So one unintended outcome of this crisis is that many organizations are seeing a fundamental mismatch between the internal structures they had in place before and the speed and agility with which we need to have to respond to this crisis. And this is certainly true at the Atlantic. So if you go to the next slide, we're learning that right now is the time to remove hurdles to break down any silos that may exist and to eliminate as much red tape as possible. And so for this, I want to return to the example of the social distance podcast that I've mentioned a couple times. So right around the same time we published the piece, The Do's and Don'ts of Social Distancing, a couple of our team members had an evening call to just chat about overall coverage of COVID-19. And they have a spontaneous idea on the call. What if we were to do a daily podcast about what it's like to live in these circumstances? And so they described this as being a total experiment. They just decided to run with the idea. And the very next day, one of the team members connected with James Hamlin, who is our health writer, who's a non-practicing physician. And they just recorded this off-the-cuff informal Skype call in which they talked about the magnitude of the situation. And the following day, the podcast Social Distance went live. So the premise is it's a daily conversation between two friends in New York. And in one early episode, they walked to the grocery store together. They narrated the activity on New York City's streets and what changes will be necessary. And in future episodes, they invited guests ranging from Atlantic writers to medical professionals to one of their brothers who was an out-of-work bartender in Austin. So interestingly, the speed that all of this came together turned out to be a key feature of the podcast. Instead of being a liability, which is the way we might have thought it would have turned out, the production value is super low compared to other Atlantic podcasts. Most notably, we just launched a podcast a few months ago called Floodlines, which required a year of reporting and production, and it's focused on the environmental impact of Hurricane Katrina. But what's nice about the social distance is that this lo-fi informal quality really fits the moment that we're in right now. You know, we're living in a world of Zoom calls, of meandering conversations with friends, trying to make sense of what the heck is going on for all of us. And because of the speed that we were able to launch this, we were able to secure the very choice title of Social Distance. So I think the lesson here is the Atlantic has typically been really slow to adopt to the podcast wave. We tend to really take our time to be methodical, to make sure that we're putting out a top quality, unique product. And I would say the same is generally true for arts organizations pre-COVID-19 as well. You really want to take the time to be thoughtful and put out something with high production value, something that looks and sounds beautiful. And in this case, we really tore up our existing playbook. And it begs the question, which is, you know, how much of that playbook do we really need to preserve in the future? So if you go to the next slide. So simultaneously, we've also been reimagining how we're defining team roles and responsibilities. And I'll go through this quickly so that we can get to some questions. But I think the most important thing here is that we're giving our team members the space to focus on their strengths, especially if they're critical to response efforts, and letting people follow their ideas, even if that means that we're flexing into new territory. So on the left-hand side, you see some of our expert writers who are actually focusing on new terrains right now, things that they wouldn't have focused on before. And on the middle there, you see some of our writers who are focused more on health and science, who are tried and true experts, who are just really doubling down on their strengths and their expertise because it's so critical right now. At the same time, because of how much is going on, we have a newsroom of 150 people, which again is small by newsroom standards, but is fairly large in other contexts. But we introduced a new weekly all hands meeting to ensure that all of these efforts align in this moment, especially when typical roles and responsibilities are in flux. And so, you know, at each of your organizations, I'm sure there are countless examples of this happening right now, people being tasked with new roles and responsibilities, rolling out new programming, rolling out new services, as well as changes to the workflows and how you function and communicate as a team. It can also appear in how you pivot or adapt the ways that you communicate with your audiences because of these shifts. And for an example of how this is playing out in the context of one of the organizations that we work with, we'll go to the next slide. So the Renewal Project is our partnership with Allstate. It is a platform that shares stories of leadership in communities across the country. We've been running it for close to 4 years, and as something that's focused on community renewal, you can imagine that its mission became more relevant over the past couple months as this crisis has emerged. And what we saw is, you know, as COVID-19 began to really devastate communities and put additional stress on nonprofits and leaders in those communities, we really needed to adapt what this platform was and how it was serving in the moment. So it's a subtle, but it's a noteworthy shift. Whereas the storytelling platform typically showcases how individuals and organizations serve their communities, we actually now needed to have it actually enable individuals and organizations to better serve those communities. So first, through the newsletter, we responded, which is where we have our most loyal readers. We asked those readers for nonprofits that are serving the most vulnerable populations and for stories. Our engagement rates jumped up and we were inundated with responses. And that really led us to turn the site into a nationwide virtual community message board of sorts. We published a running list of nonprofits to donate to, and we increased the frequency of our newsletter to twice a week so that we can continue to share and solicit stories. And you can see some of the reader responses on this slide that we've gotten. So, for arts organizations, this shift is certainly happening. I think most notably in how you deliver content during the pandemic. Early on, we saw this kind of first wave of organizations sharing archival footage or live streams of stage productions, but these aren't really optimized for the digital platforms that they're appearing on. So now we're seeing kind of the second or third wave of organizations that have taken the time to adjust their responses, to make those subtle shifts. And they're relying on their strengths, but they're bringing these strengths to life in new ways on new platforms. So none of these efforts are as intentional as they may seem in the Atlantic side. We're hearing in conversations with our newsroom, we're just acting on the moment right now. We haven't really given much thought to long-term strategies, but I think the bottom line here is that these are great opportunities to inform long-term strategy, and the success of these efforts themselves are informed by how strong your existing brand strategy is. It's being nimble, but yes, it's a pivot, and it should be viewed as an extension of where you've been before and an opportunity to really reshape the future as opposed to kind of throwing everything out and starting from scratch. So that brings us to the summary. This is a great page to print out and tack up wherever you need the inspiration for it. But that brings us to the end of our lessons, and happy to take some questions and continue the conversation.
And sure, thank you so much, Julie and Trinity. A question for you that kind of fits the moment for many arts organizations. You're exactly right. There was kind of this wave of let's clean out the attic, right? And let's get archived content out there, then new content to the extent possible. And they've been creatively finding other ways to put content online. I know you've done research in the space that focused on the need to build audience connection, not just content. Can you talk a little bit about what you found there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think referencing that kind of first wave of just putting stuff out there that was maybe meant for a different platform, right? It's meant for an in-person experience. And no matter how hard we try, it's not going to translate super well to this digital experience. And part of that is because in talking with a lot of organizations and looking at the research, it's because when people come to our performance, when people come to our gallery, there's a social aspect to experiencing that content. And that connection piece is not fully replicated in the digital environment. And you think about, our audiences don't want to be passive consumers of content, especially right now when there's such a vacuum in connecting with people. They really want to not just consume the content, they want to have this shared experience around that content. And so that's what has been missing, I think, in some of these experiences. And so to the extent that you can build in opportunities to have that connection piece, and I think there's maybe a spectrum of ways to do that, right? You could set up a chat box, and the kind of the low end of it is giving people a way to talk about the content as it's happening in real time. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's really designing kind of personalized experiences that feel like it's an extension of your brand. And it's not just something that every organization could do. And I think what I saw in the research is, in order to really do that, I think one thing is to feature your staff voices, let them be an extension of your brand. I mean, they are your brand. So let them moderate those conversations, put them front and center. I think along with that, be really transparent about how much work is going on behind the scenes. I think there's a myth that we all have to present this public facing, we've got everything under control, we've project this level of confidence, but, I think it's okay. And it can really build community and build connection if people can see how hard you're working right now to give them the experiences that you're giving them. And I think the third important point is really to try to match the experience to the platform. So don't just like take something that is meant for the stage and put it online, but make sure it really feels like it belongs in a digital platform.
Got it. Interesting. I'm getting Karen Noose has a question for us. Is there an analog to a Zoom call for audiences? Meaning on these Zoom calls, we all enjoy seeing who and where everyone came from. Is this valuable for audience experiences online for arts material? Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if Zoom is the perfect platform for it. I think, I know personally, actually, I have an example of this. An organization that I very, very near and dear to my heart in DC, a small arts education organization. They did kind of an online like fundraiser a couple of weekends ago, and they used Zoom for it. And at the end of the work week, I'm like really Zoom fatigued. I don't want to join any more video calls. I don't want to feel like I have to like, dress up from the waist up. And so that wasn't an ideal experience for me. So I don't know, I mean, just personally, I don't know that Zoom is the perfect solution to that, but I think the ability to provide ways to have like a moderated conversation alongside whatever content it is that you're consuming, I think that's the core piece. You want to be able to give people an outlet to talk about it. It doesn't necessarily have to be, fully video.
Interesting, thanks. You can file this under opening a can of worms too late, but one of the things that a lot of our members are facing as weeks turn to months, turn to truly unknown on the time horizon here, is how much to view all of these efforts that we're talking about as a bridge versus just a new way of being. And I am sure that the Atlantic, when it was thinking about its long form content at the center, grappled with the same kind of question. Was there a mindset shift there that might be helpful for people on the call?
Yeah, I can take a stab and then Trinity, if you want to chime in. I think similar, the comment around production value of, putting something out there and being willing to test and try things quickly and to get feedback is very similar to the way that we approached social media for social media's sake versus using it to drive traffic to the long form that you mentioned, Pope. So it used to be the mindset that you have to invest in the cover story on the Atlantic and you have to put all your eggs in the cover story basket. And then the things around it, social media, whatever, is really meant just to drive stuff back to that cover story. And we've really evolved our mindset in that social media should be an experience in and of itself. And in order to do that really well, you have to be willing to put small bites of things out there that are tailored for the platform quickly, get feedback, test it, learn from your experiments, and then kind of repeat that whole cycle. And so we've seen, yes, there is still the investment in developing the flagship pieces, but you have to also invest in testing and trying things on some of these newer platforms.
Yeah, I would just add, there is a multitude of choices that audiences make every day. And whether that is around what sites they're visiting, what content they're consuming, it's also around what device they are on, right? And where they are, throughout their day. And so to Julie's point, we've really tried to think about this phenomenon of, people spending 30 seconds with a tweet. Like, we want to make a meaningful connection through that tweet, right? If, again, as I said, sort of reading a headline in a newsletter, like that headline needs to be as just as much value as the piece that it is leading into. And, I think kind of taking a step back and just realizing that this is a way that people interact with content now. is important because it's a new reality. And, you know, content for content's sake is not a strategy. It's really more about what are those meaningful interactions that people can have with your organization, whether they have 30 seconds or 30 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you both. We're, of course, at time, and we have more questions. So for those of you on the line, we'll make sure that you get answers to your questions, and then we'll include them in tomorrow's summary. Thanks to both of you so much. We couldn't be more pleased than to have you here, and we're so grateful for sharing your lessons. I hope that everyone on the line, you will go to the Arts Resiliency Center on our site, and that you'll reach out to us if you have any questions. We're here to serve, and we will host another webinar next week, and by being on this one, you will automatically get an invitation. You can see a poll here, which we'll leave open for a few minutes to give your feedback, and we look forward to seeing all of you very soon. And in the meantime, please stay safe. Thank you, Julie, Trinity, and thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.